The mountain did not wake so much as bare its teeth. Dawn was only a rumor in the Blackthorn Highlands. A thin bruise of light pressed against the horizon, and the cold moved with the caution of a hunter that already owned the ground. I climbed, with my breath kept small and my steps counted, pretending there was a rhythm here I could learn before it learned me. Snow gave way under my boots in soft collapses, each one a confession that I was heavier than I wanted to be, and louder than I could afford. The ridge kept its distance like a witness who had sworn an oath. Below, the valley folded into itself, pines stitched along the seams, each trunk tattooed with old injuries. I saw the first mark in passing, a long vertical scrape that had healed into a silver welt, and then another, deeper, as if something with patience had rehearsed the motion until the tree understood the lesson. I did not touch the scars. The air around them carried a dull pressure, like a hand over a mouth, and I did not want to know whether the mountain would pull me closer or push me away. The notebook rode against my ribs and warmed enough to remind me it existed. The leather had cracked along the spine where my grandfather's thumb had rested, for years, opening to the same pages again and again, until the paper learned its route. He had written in a patient hand that never apologized for what it believed. 2 crowns, 1 moon. Blood is the verdict. No man decides it, it decides the man. I wanted the lines to be superstition, a family hobby that forgot to die. The Highlands disliked my wants. The first sound arrived as if it had never left. A slow exhale that thickened into a growl, uneven, raw, frayed by old hunger. It rose without hurry, the way a storm rises beyond sight, and laid a weight on my chest that felt like history stepping onto my bones. Then a second voice stood up inside the cold, smooth, deliberate. A measured howl that did not ask for permission and did not need to raise itself to be heard. The calls did not meet so much as measure one another. One tore at the air, one carved it. I had read about werewolves in language that loved spectacle, and about lycanthropes in paragraphs that loved purity. Here the words dropped their costumes. The bite-born beast that answers the moon like a dog to a whistle. The bloodline predator that keeps its mind and wields the curse like a blade. Both voices were present, old rivals. And the ridge bore their argument the way a field bears the weight of 2 bulls with no fence between them. The trail announced itself in a brightness of trampled snow. The first prints sank deep, claws splayed. The pads skidding where speed outpaced control, 10 paces away. A second path stepped forward with insulting precision, heel to toe. The elongated foot of a biped who had made gravity sign a contract. These tracks did not mingle, they circled, they cut across, they paced. In one place, the paths ran side by side for 3 strides, and then parted like a quarrel that remembered how the last one ended. The carcass waited where the wind could not steal its steam. A stag reduced to lessons, one flank shredded, ribs peeled like reeds, violence that favored blunt truth. The other flank flayed with a surgeon's boredom. Muscle opened to seam lines, organs rearranged as if someone wanted to read them. I crouched and the blood smell rolled into my mouth as a coin of iron. The snow beside the antlers brimmed with a small artifact that the mountain had not buried. A crescent pendant caught on the tines, twin to the one under my shirt, twin to the one my grandfather had dropped into my palm with a hand that shook for reasons he never named. The metal held a smear that the cold could not harden. A bruise of old rust that looked like it had never been wet, and yet would never dry. Higher up the ridge, stones lay overturned as if a giant had been searching the earth for its missing teeth. The bark of 3 pines had been shaved to pale flesh, and on that flesh were sigils not meant for eyes that flinched, broken circles, forked crescent lines that refused to join, a spiral that ran inward until it ended not in a center but in a jagged absence where the blade had broken, or the hand had decided that completion was a lie. The second howl returned in a lower register, less voice and more geometry, the sound of a crown being set on a skull that had earned it. The first howl answered from the ravine, a ripped shout of defiance. Between them, snow dust lifted from the ground and hung in the air like breath that forgot where to go. I moved toward the ridge crest, not because I wanted to see, but because seeing sometimes keeps you from being seen first. Their bodies resolved out of the kind of distance that feels like a decision on the left shoulder of the ridge. A hulking shape loped forward on a posture that could not decide between biped and quadruped. The musculature rampant under a hide, matted by old fights and fresh weather. Amber eyes burned with the simple mathematics of hunger on the right shoulder. An upright figure stood in a stillness that suggested contempt for motion itself. Dark fur lay sleek as a uniform, muscles, quiet but arranged with the soldier's economy. And the eyes were a polished silver that reflected without returning anything of the mind behind them. The werewolf snarled, and the sound had edges. The lycanthrope did not snarl. It inclined its head a fraction, as if acknowledging a ritual that required acknowledgement before the violence could begin. The mountain prepared itself the way a room braces when two men step inside, who have killed one another many times already in their imaginations. Every tree leaned inward, every stone learned to listen. They should have ignored me. I wanted them to ignore me. But something in the way I stood on that strip of ground drew both sets of eyes, as if a third crown had arrived without invitation. The werewolf scented the air, and found the line I had drawn from the valley to here. The lycanthrope regarded the crescent under my shirt, as if it could see metal through bone. I felt the pendant answer against my skin, with a cold that did not belong to temperature. There is a moment in any hunt when the prey recognizes the choreography already written in the ground. The body understands the order before the mind signs it. The werewolf dropped to all fours and threw itself downhill in a syntax of speed that did not include mercy. Snow detonated under each stride. The lycanthrope descended like a verdict. Not fast, not slow, simply inevitable, each step placed where the next one could only ever be. I wanted to run. Running promised the small kindness of pretending I could change the rules by refusing to play. My legs didn't move. The mountain held me with a hand that was not a hand, and the air in my chest grew tight as fabric pulled too hard over a form that had outgrown it. A pressure blossomed at the hinge of my jaw, an ache as if bones rehearsed a broader role in secret. The pendant burned until the shape of it branded my sternum, and then cooled into a weight that felt like a word I did not know yet. The ground trembled not with their approach but with their intention. Claw marks reached me before they did. A scatter of fresh gouges as the werewolf corrected for speed, and a neat array of elongated footprints that revealed nothing of the lycanthrope's pulse. The air filled with a damp sweetness of hair and wet skin and something older. A mineral scent like rocks turned inside out. Wind tried to participate, and failed. Sound flattened into a plane where every frequency that mattered had been taken. I saw the place on the snow where the two trails had crossed hours earlier and left a starburst of fractures healed. Under a transparency of ice, I stepped back to avoid it, without knowing why. The starburst had learned the pattern of impact, and did not want a new one. Behind me, the ridge completed its thought. Above me, the sky thinned until the light took on the color of a steel tool. The werewolf reached the first line of stones and bounded, clearing the ring with a feral joy that did not require an audience. The lycanthrope did not jump. It entered through a gap as if an invitation awaited it. Their paths divided around me, like a river split by a rock too stubborn to move. The werewolf's breath struck my face as heat and rot and living iron. The lycanthrope's wake passed over me as a cold that organized my blood into columns. In the space between their bodies, I stood like a question a judge refuses to clarify. I understood then what the notebook had meant by test, not a contest of strength or a riddle to be solved, but a weighing, blood set on one pan, fate on the other, and a moon hung above the scale with the arrogance of a god that had watched this play 1,000 nights and never once grown bored. Snow settled, silence arrived as if summoned. Somewhere beyond the ridge, an unseen flock tore itself from a tree and ran into the sky without sound. And that was the omen that mattered, flight without noise, panic that respected the ritual enough to be silent for it. The werewolf turned its head and showed me a mouth that had learned to break bone the way a hand learns to close. The lycanthrope looked beyond me, eyes fixed on An older horizon, where treaties were broken and reforged in blood. Between them, the mountain waited for the first movement that would become many. In my chest, something opened like a door that had not been touched for years. The knight stepped through it. The purity test began, not with a roar, but with a shadow passing over the snow that did not match the bodies that made it. A third shape stretched and lean. A crown of absence where a head should be. And I knew then that rivalry had lived here longer than names, and that I had brought a name it wanted to forget. Morning arrived, like it was ashamed to be seen. Light fell weak over the highlands, seeping through low clouds in colorless threads. Barely enough to distinguish ice from bone. The ridge where they had stood last night still loomed above me, its shadow trailing into my camp like the reach of something that had not finished speaking. My breath left in shallow bursts that felt too loud in the stillness. The tense skin was stiff with cold, but not untouched. 3 deep scratches raked the fabric over my head. Each cut stopped just short of opening the seam, not from lack of strength, but from choice. Something had leaned close enough to map the curve of my skull through the material, close enough to smell my sleeping breath, and decided to let me keep it. I packed slowly, as though moving too quickly might remind whatever had made those marks that it could finish the job. The crescent pendant under my shirt felt heavier now, the chain a coil against my skin. My grandfather's notebook sat at the bottom of the pack, its weight more certain than my footing. Every page I had read so far had been written with the same deliberate hand, the same measured ink. 2 crowns, 1 moon. Blood is the verdict. No man decides it. It decides the man. Last night's howls had sharpened those words into a blade. I headed down toward the village, following a frozen stream that wound through pines stripped of their lower branches. The trunks looked like a procession of spears stabbed into the earth, their tips lost in the fog. No bird calls, no movement. Just the faint groan of ice shifting beneath its own weight. The air was still, but I kept catching smells that didn't belong, an animal musk edged with metal. The sour rot of meat that had been bled and left to stiffen. The village appeared in pieces, rooflines rising through the mist. Stone chimneys exhaled smoke that hung instead of drifting, as if reluctant to leave the safety of the hearths. Faces watched from behind warped glass as I passed, none staying long enough to meet my eyes. I stepped into the post office because it was the only door that opened when I reached for it. Inside, the heat was thin and smelled faintly of burning sage. The clerk didn't speak, just slid a small parcel across the counter wrapped in brown paper and bound with twine. My name was written in block letters on the label, though I had never given it here. I tore the paper and found a rubbing on stiff vellum, ring of carved wolves in profile. Each muzzle raised toward a central circle that had been deliberately gouged out. Ink at the bottom spelled 2 words in a careful, old-fashioned hand, purity kept. There was no sender's name. I folded the rubbing and slipped it into my coat, feeling the clerk's eyes on me even when I didn't look up. Outside, the street was nearly empty. A funeral notice fluttered on the bulletin board beside the door. The photograph faded and warped. The man's face was unclear, blurred where the ink had run, but his eyes were silver in the print. The path from the village cut back toward the higher ground, winding through bare-limbed trees whose shadows reached like black veins across the snow. I followed the stream until it bent sharply around a stand of alder. The ice had broken here, revealing dark water. Bones lay scattered in the shallows, pale and polished by the current. Most were small, deer or goat. But one lay farther up the bank, a human skull, the jaw healed wrong, like it had been broken and reformed for a mouth it was never meant to have. Around its neck hung a chain with a pendant exactly like mine. I didn't take it. The metal seemed to pulse faintly, as though holding it would link me to whatever had left it here. The air thickened until breathing felt like swallowing oil. Somewhere above, a branch shifted without the sound of wind, and I knew I was being measured again, weighed against whatever verdict this place demanded. The trail climbed to a plateau where the ruin of a chapel crouched at the edge of the tree line. Its roof sagged inward, the walls bowed with age, but the doorway stood intact, a dark mouth inviting me to step in. Inside, The air was colder than it had been outside. Colder than stone should allow. Rows of pews had rotted into ribs. The floor bore deep claw marks that cut in parallel from the door toward the altar space. The walls had once been painted. Beneath the peeling plaster, shapes emerged, human figures kneeling around a central presence that refused to stay one thing. Some nights, the image might have been a man, other nights, a wolf. Most of the time, it was both, and neither seemed at peace with the other. Above them, a moon had been scratched out so violently that the stone beneath showed through. The scent in the chapel was wrong for a ruin. Sweetness threaded with copper. My boots ground against the grit of old plaster as I walked toward the front. The altar was gone, leaving a rectangular shadow where something heavy had once been. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched from too many angles at once. When I turned to leave, I saw it in the dust on the nearest pure handprint. Long-fingered, ending in crescents, the print faced the door, not the altar. Whoever had left it hadn't been here to pray. The afternoon began to fail. The sky's light flattened, shadows sharpening until they seemed carved into the snow. I climbed back toward the ridge, because the ridge was the only honest thing here. It carried its violence in plain sight. The trees thinned as I neared the top, revealing a clearing encircled by squat stones. The ground inside had been churned to ice and refrozen, smooth as glass. Embedded in it were coarse black hairs that caught a red gleam in the failing light, and finer strands that looked burned flat. I crouched at the edge, feeling the cold radiate upward in steady waves. The ice reflected my face, and something above it, a second silhouette. Lena, crowned with ears that weren't human. My jaw ached, as though my bones recognized the shape. Movement brushed the tree line, a blur low to the ground. Pacing the edge of the clearing, another shape moved opposite it, upright and deliberate. The tracks they left told the rest. One set heavy and clawed, momentum carving shallow arcs in the snow. The other set longer, surer, each step a claim. The circle between them was a wound in the earth. And I understood then that this was not just their hunting ground. This was their dueling floor. Every scar in the bark, every gouge in the ice, was part of a tally carved over decades. The light died quickly. I started down the slope toward my camp, but the forest leaned closer, trunks drawing in like a mouth closing. Halfway down, I saw it first snagged on a broken branch, dark and coarse. Beneath it, a single strand that gleamed faintly, metallic and strange against the snow. I rolled it between my fingers and my skin tightened, as if it knew which creature had shed it. By the time I reached my tent, the night had settled in completely. The entrance flap bore a knot tied from sinew, a perfect loop with a twist I recognized from the chapel wall. Beneath it, pressed into the snow, a palm print with fingers ending in crescents. Long, patient. The Highlands had stopped pretending. Night pressed its ear to the canvas and learned the rhythm of my breath. I lay still until the cold crept up my spine like a patient companion, and the knot of sinew on the tent flap tightened without moving. Sleep came the way a snare closes, slow enough to feel every notch, and when it finally took me, it brought the old corridor dream. The one with walls that breathe and doors that don't believe in hinges. At the end of that corridor stood the ridge, and upon the ridge two crowns waited beneath a pared-down moon. One crown writhed like hunger that refused instruction. The other shone with a metal patience that would outlast the weather. They tilted, not toward each other, but toward me, and the corridor shortened until there was no corridor at all. I woke into a silence that had been curated. The Highlands had lifted sound out of the world and put it somewhere safe while they decided what I was for. Frost laced the inner walls of the tent in fern patterns, delicate and fixed. When I brushed them, they collapsed without resistance, the way memory collapses when you try to make it behave. The palm print outside the entrance had iced over and now held a moon inside each fingertip. I stepped over it because to step on it would be to say a thing I was not ready to say. The morning did not perform, it merely arrived, thin and bright, laying a hard light over everything soft. The clearing of stones sat above me with the same expectation as yesterday. But something had altered in the way the trees leaned. Their branches remembered wait. I followed that memory outward, along a shelf of rock that overlooked the ravine, a good place to watch without being seen. Unless the watcher wanted you seen, the first sound came small. A faint clatter like bone against shale, then the air changed. Temperature without changing temperature. The way it does when something large enters it. I saw the werewolf first, down in the dark seam between hills, moving not stealthy but fast, as if stealth were for animals that feared consequence. Its fur was dotted with ice, and with each stride, that ice shattered and fell away, in glitter that did not touch the ground because the ground moved too quickly beneath it. It came on a diagonal that implied a plan learned from too many mistakes. Across the ravine, the lycanthrope revealed itself the way a decision reveals its preface. Nothing sudden, no drama. It stepped out from the black rafter of pines with the posture of a figure who had never in its life negotiated with gravity. Its head turned, and the silver of its eyes corroborated the cold. It did not glance at me, which felt like the worst kind of attention. The werewolf hit the creek in a single bound and threw water into a shape that tried to be a man standing and failed. Ice broke under its weight. The lycanthrope walked the same creek like a hall and never disturbed the surface. They converged, where the bank lifted into a narrow run of deer trail and the ground there had prepared for them by letting everything loose. The fight began before the first impact, in the tilt of shoulders, in the flex of wrists, in the way the mouth arranges itself when the mind has left the room but the body knows the ritual by heart. The werewolf struck with a joy so ugly it felt holy, a rush, a shoulder twist, a forearm across a throat thick with fur. The sound was wet wood breaking. The lycanthrope gave ground without ceding space, a writing of balance so precise it punished. The idea of chaos, claws flashed and carved 4 ragged marks into the black pelt of the taller beast. The taller beast bled without acknowledgement and hammered a knee into the werewolf's ribs in a motion to human to forgive. Steam rose in columns where their bodies met. The smell reached me a breath later. Sweat sharpened to iron, and under it, something tannic and bitter. The scent of old oaths burned to ash and inhaled. They tore uphill and the trees made way because this was a known path, an aisle in an old cathedral where the pews were trunks and the worship was injury. Snow peeled back in crescents. Bark lifted like knuckles. The world kept a ledger in gouges, and the ledger filled. The werewolf's tempo seemed manic until I saw its method. Feints that framed a killing angle, a drag of claws to bait the guard high. Then a low attack to hamstring. The lycanthrope answered with economy, no wasted gesture, palms open, then knives, elbow, then absence. Its counters turned the werewolf's fury into motion around a center that never lost temperature. It was like watching weather argue with a blade. They hit the stone ring, and the glass inside cracked along old fault lines that remembered where to break. I realized my hands were bloodless from how hard I had clenched them and loosened my fingers one by one. An inventory taken with reluctance. The werewolf surged and drove the lycanthrope backward across the glass. And when the tall shape slipped, it did not fall. It reached back with an offhand grace and found one of the squat stones and used it as a spine to spring from, landing behind the charge and catching the werewolf through the flank with a forearm that had become a spear. The noise was animal and untranslatable, snow-geysered, and settled like ash. My body moved before my judgment did. I slid along the shelf, to a vantage closer to the ring, eyes never leaving them long enough to see where my feet went. The shelf ended in a shallow switchback, and the switchback ended in a hollow where roots knuckled up like fists. A tree there had rotted from the core outward and left a mouth in its trunk big enough to take a man. The old phrase laid itself down in my blood as if it had always lived there. He still waits beneath the hollow tree. I saw nothing in the mouth. The nothing saw me. The fight left the ring and entered the trees again, a scatter of ruptures moving. In parallel, I followed because not to follow was to pretend that distance was any sort of shelter. The forest floor heaved where they passed. A spray of hair landed against my sleeve and clung with static, coarse and dark. And beside it, a single filament that flashed metallic even in shade. Every howl is a name forgotten, walked inside the Bones of the trees. The sound did not travel through air. It traveled through wood, and then into me. They reached the ravine's far hip, and separated not by choice, but by terrain. The werewolf took the higher cut and fired down, tearing saplings into clubs, throwing roots like chains. The lycanthrope dropped lower and used the slope's ice as a weapon, sliding beneath the blows, catching ankle, spinning, rising. A continuous sentence of violence, with no punctuation for apology. A pine toppled, and its fall took a minute because time had slowed to accommodate spectacle. I flinched when it struck, and the shock shook powdered snow out of branches on my side of the ravine, and coated my hood in a bridal veil of cold. They found each other again at a shelf of rock that jutted like a jaw. The werewolf drove the lycanthrope back against the lip and hammered down. Pure insistence, a drumbeat composed for bones. The lycanthrope yielded the final inch and then vanished under the strike, dropping backward with a twist that would have broken a person without a second shape to betray. It dragged the werewolf over the edge with it. They fell together, an unwilling embrace, and when they hit the ledge below the mountain, coughed dust and swallowed the sound. I was moving before I knew it, down the cut, sliding on my heels, catching branches, tasting bark, until the ledge rose under me and demanded balance. They had separated in the fall. The werewolf had found a footing and launched again, but this time the launch carried a stutter. The ribs that had taken the knee earlier were complaining in a language the rest of the animal could not ignore. The lycanthrope's mouth peeled back, not into a snarl, into a shape that suggested comprehension. It pressed the advantage with a flurry of strikes boxed into impossible geometry, and drove the werewolf into the wall. The wall cracked. The wall decided to be a door. They burst through into a shallow cave, and the dark took them. I was at the lip an instant later, and whatever caution I still owned was set gently on the ground and told to wait. The cave air came out hot and damp, thick, with wet stone, and an undertaste of something old that had never loved the sun. The floor pitched downward into a narrow throat, and in that throat I could hear their feet talking to rock. There is a cadence to pursuit that even unfamiliar species share. It was not hunter and prey. It was rival and rival, old grievance solving. Itself on the only page both could read. The throat opened into a chamber the size of a chapel. The metaphor was not careless. The chamber had once been used the way chapels are used. The walls wore the ghosts of sigils, burnt black, and then sanded down half visible. A palimpsest of rules in a language that did not care if you could read it. In the center of the floor, a circle of machines lay in silent pieces, traps or instruments, all of them kissed by silver. Chains coiled in cold heaps that remembered wrists. A table sat at the far end, sturdier than the others, carved from a single slab of dark stone. On it, carved deeply, the crescent again, and inside the crescent, a smaller mark that had not been present on mine, a notch like a toothprint. My breath shortened. I reached for the pendant under my shirt, because human hands need talismans when logic resigns. The pendant warmed and then cooled until I could feel the exact lines of the crescent inside my sternum, as though the metal had been pressed through. The chamber accepted my presence as an old joke being retold. And not for the first time I thought of far places where the same story breeds under new names. On a Wisconsin backroad, the locals still whisper that the brave road beast was never destroyed. It bred. The rumor had felt ridiculous when I read it in the yellowed column of a county paper. Here, it felt like an ancestor. The werewolf exploded out of the shadow to my right, a thunderbolt of hair and tendon, and the impact that should have ended me took the pillar between us instead. Stone powdered into a veil, and my ears turned everything into underwater. I stumbled, went to a knee, and saw the lycanthrope glide along the left wall. An absence where lights should sit. It passed within arm's length, and the cold in its wake picked my bones up and set them down again in a cleaner order. It was not mercy, it was taxonomy. They met in the center, and the chapel floor accepted their weight like a baptismal. Silver chimed where claws struck chains, sparks ran like insects. The werewolf's mouth opened and closed, a red metronome. And the lycanthrope's hands found the jaw and held it, and the muscles in its forearms stood up like cords, and for a long second the two bodies became a sculpture of refusal. Then the sculpture moved. The jaw slid left under pressure, and a tendon snapped somewhere with the finality of an oath rewritten. The werewolf howled, and the howl put my name on a pyre. Every howl is a name forgotten, and I realized the sentence was not prophecy. It was arithmetic. Something inside my mouth changed shape. A small thing, a rehearsal, the pressure at the hinge, returned and then passed, leaving the ache of a promise. I touched my jaw with shaking fingers and found a ridge on the inner gum that had not been there yesterday. A hardening like a seam under fresh plaster. The skin of my forearms tightened. The hair there seemed darker. The world swam a moment, and settled with a clarity that punished detail. They crashed toward me, and I scrambled sideways, the motion of a puppet cut free too late. The lycanthrope's shoulder brushed the table and left a smear that shone silver, then dulled. The werewolf's claws gouged the crescent and made the notch deeper. Something in the room woke that had only been sleeping because it had been asked. Nicely, the air thickened to syrup. The sound of their bodies became distant without getting quieter. The chamber chose sides or pretended to, and either way, the choice involved me. I backed into a spill of chains, and they wrapped my ankles with the intimacy of snakes that have known your heat before. My fingers fought them. Found slack, found teeth, found a loop that had been shaped to bite and not let go. The metal was cold enough to feel like water, my breath fogged. The fight bent away from me in a centrifugal arc, and the two shapes slammed the far wall and stayed there. Heaving, animal lungs working like bellows beside a forge that has never gone out. The floor shook then, not from impact, but from something older, negotiating its return. Hair slithered across the stone in slow drafts. A smell of damp wood rose from the back of the chamber, where the rock had rotted into a maze of root. The hollow tree the old words had promised was not on the surface after all. It was here, inverted, feeding on stone instead of sky. He still waits beneath the hollow tree. Stood up and walked through me on a spine of cold. The lycanthrope went still. The werewolf lifted its head and scented. For an instant they were not rivals, they were animals called to a third presence. The chamber listened the way a graveyard listens when it hears footsteps that belong to someone not yet dead. My ankle freed itself when the chain remembered it had rust. I stood with care, a surgeon would admire, and felt the notch in the crescent inside my shirt align with the notch carved into the stone. Not by touch, by agreement. The pendant grew heavy. The room accepted a new actor, far above, beyond rock and snow and the patience of pines. The pale day leaned toward evening and failed to explain itself. The fight would resume, the hunger would shift again. The Highlands would continue their curation of sound and fear, but the story had widened underground, and inside my mouth a tooth pressed once against gum and then withdrew, leaving the message intact for now: send your transformation story if you survive. The words did not need a voice, they had the room, they had the blood, they had me. The chamber exhaled, and the stone seemed to breathe with it. A slow tide moving through mineral lungs. Dust drifted from the root-choked ceiling, and turned the air into a pale soup that tasted faintly of old coins. The lycanthrope stood in profile to the dark, listening with its whole body. Shoulders angled like blades resting in their sheaths. The werewolf rolled its weight from paw to paw, the manic patience of an engine building heat. A tremble under the skin that promised combustion. Between them, the crescent cut into the slab, drank every stray light, and kept none to return. The first motion came from the walls, not the rivals. The blackened sigils along the stone brightened in a way that was not light, more like memory resurfacing. A spiral lifted itself from the soot and unfurled toward the floor, ending in a small gouge that matched the notch in my pendant and the notch carved into the altar. The room wanted alignment. The room insisted on it. I backed away, and my heel found the edge of an iron hoop fixed to the flagstone. A rust-slick ring with a stain beneath it that the years had sanded but not erased. The stain carried the old scent of silver polish and blood moon ceremony. Bone, fire, smoke, threaded with prayer and threat. Werewolf transformation recorded in the pores of the rock. The lycanthrope moved first, no longer waiting for the werewolf to compose its frenzy. It crossed the chamber in 3 precise strides, and the sound of those strides changed the temperature in my mouth. Hands opened like tools. One palm found the werewolf's throat, where tendons met fury. The other slipped beneath the ribs too. Pin the animal against the wall. Not a throw, a fastening. The werewolf answered by becoming storm. A rake of claws that cut the silver eyes into narrow coins. A headbutt that cracked stone. A kick that would shatter a deer's hindquarter and did not shift this opponent by an inch. There is a shape the body takes when it understands that hatred has outlived reason. The werewolf took that shape and bit down. The lycanthrope's forearm disappeared between dentition designed for bone. The crunch was intimate and obscene. The tall shape did not flinch, only tightened its grip and forced the werewolf's head sideways until joints protested and a tendon twanged like a strung wire. The red that spilled onto the floor wrote a sentence the chamber had read many times. The sentence continued in me. Every howl is a name forgotten. The werewolf tried to remember its own and lost seconds to the effort. The ceiling groaned, roots shifted, settling deeper into years. From the back of the cave, a corridor sloped into a dark athroat the chamber had not shown us before. Air fat with dampened age pushed out. As if something far below had sighed, the rivals paused on the same heartbeat and turned toward that black incline with ears forward, mirror alert. The stillness lasted only long enough to expose a new hierarchy. The hidden presence commanded attention. The rivals resented it. The werewolf tore its forearm free and left a ribbon of meat in the lycanthrope's mouth. The lycanthrope spat without ceremony and struck again. They crashed across the circle of traps and instruments, tangling in chains. That remembered wrists and promises. Lynx shrieked, a choir of iron confessing. A snapped length whipped my calf and cut clean through fabric and skin. Pain went up my thigh like a fuse. Warm wetness followed and slid into my boot where it pooled with the low heat a body keeps even in a cave that hoards cold. The blood set the crescent pendant to a slow pulse where it rested against my sternum. The pulse answered a second rhythm I had not noticed until then. Tucked deeper, marrow deep, an extra beat under the human one, quieter but certain. I pressed a palm to my chest and felt the 2 tempos argue. The lycanthrope slammed the werewolf onto the altar slab, and that was a mistake because the slab was not furniture. The crescent cut into it, drank the impact, and regurgitated intention. The glyph flared in a dull silver that resembled moon through fog. The light found the werewolf's chest and held it down without weight. The werewolf convulsed, a full body shudder. Muscles mapping themselves again, the convulsion rippled outward and caught me on its surf. My jaw clicked at the hinge, and did not settle where it had been. The teeth behind the canine roots pressed like sprouts in spring soil. Not yet, said some old arithmetic in my blood. Soon, said the chamber. The lycanthrope recognized the slab's awakening and abandoned the pin. It swept left, avoiding the crescent's circle, and closed again with a precision that made me think of a surgeon who had chosen battlefield medicine for sport. A low strike to the knee, an elbow to the throat, 2 fingers into the soft place where shoulder becomes chest. Then, a step back exactly 1 stride, the dance of a creature who counted scars as curriculum. The werewolf clawed lines through the air, through stone, through the story, and one of those lines caught the lycanthrope across the abdomen, opening. A vertical mouth, steam, and black blood smoked into the cave. The lycanthrope looked down at the wound, the way a king looks at a nuisance, and then stepped into pain, as if it were weather. The chain under my boot shifted when it should not have. Metal bid me follow. The iron ring at the floor's edge rolled to reveal something hidden in the seam between flagstones. A plate the size of a hand, engraved with a broken circle crossing. A forked crescent, the same mark I had seen, burned into tree bark and tied into the sinew, not at my tent. I lifted the plate free, and the stone beneath it exhaled cold, that smelled of old rites abandoned and not forgiven. Under that cold lay a bed of ashes too fine to be from wood. I knew in my bones what those ashes were. Purity kept, said a hand. I had never shaken. Above the plateau, where snow makes the highlands look clean from a distance, the day had begun to fail. Down here, the cave did not respect the performance of time. The rivals dragged the evening in by the hair and made it kneel. They pressed each other into pillars and pulled each other through chains and carved new seams into the floor with their weight. The werewolf's breath turned ragged, a saw cutting its own handle. The lycanthrope's breath remained an equation. Their movements wrote different scriptures on the same stone, one in spittle and blood, one in geometry and the cold ink of will. I edged toward the corridor that sloped deeper. Each step was a negotiation with fear and gravity. The floor became slick with a film I did not want to name. The air thickened, the damp growing sweet as if the cave itself was ripening. The whisper came from within the rock, not from throat or wind or mind. He still waits beneath the hollow tree. The words curled around my ankles and climbed. I did not want to see what waited. I wanted to know. And wanting to know is a leash you put on yourself and then pretend you can chew through. A figure stepped into the lip of the corridor, and the rivals stopped, because even hatred remembers hierarchy. It was not a full figure, not yet. A suggestion assembled from shadow and root. A man-shaped absence with antlers of dead wood and a pelt of accumulated night. The antlers scraped the stone and left trails of powdered lime. The smell that came with it was not rot, it was old forest blood, sap hardened into amber over centuries. Dogman attack rumors turned into incense. Skinwalker tales exhaled against your ear when you're too tired to defend against superstition. It looked at the lycanthrope first, then the werewolf, then me. The mountain arranged our places in that glance. The lycanthrope lowered its head, as if acknowledging a blood moon judge. The werewolf's back arched in reflex, to pause, finding the floor, and to lifting a body both refusing and preparing to accept command. The shadow lifted one arm, and pointed to the slab. The crescent in the stone brightened again, and, for an instant, the symbol inside the crescent was not a notch, it was an eye. The rune told a story then, not in sound, not in words, but in sequence and pressure. The highlands had always tended to lines. The bite-born werewolf, contagious, cursed. Real werewolf story written anew with each victim. The bloodline, lycanthrope, inherited, trained. A cryptid encounter curated within a family that treated survival horror as scripture and birthright. The third thing, the antlered absence, had been the pact that kept the lines from erasing each other. Its patience had thinned. Its hunger for obedience had grown teeth. The lycanthrope stepped to the slab without being told twice. The werewolf lunged to stop it, and the antlered thing's head turned. The werewolf froze mid-stride as if cords had pulled its joints tight. A grunt leaked from its throat. The lycanthrope put both hands on the crescent, and the symbol lit its palms. Silver lines crawled up its forearms like frost in reverse. I felt the same lines crawl under my skin, tracing veins, mapping roots, as if the cave was taking a census of what I could become. The pendant heated until the chain branded its links into my neck and collarbone. The pain was intimate and convinced. A step sounded behind me where there should not have been floor. Someone had entered the chamber by a path the rock kept for confidants. I turned and saw the truth that had been pacing me since the village. The funeral photographs blurred. Man with silver eyes, the clerk who never spoke but handed me a parcel with a rubbing of wolves around a wound. He stood at the threshold in a coat that looked like it had been lived in by generations rather than worn by one man. His face moved through expressions like a cloud through shapes. He looked at me the way a family looks at a missing piece of furniture that has been returned carrying smoke. He inclined his head toward the slab without speaking, and that was betrayal, because I understood what he was asking from me without being asked. Another step, and I would be inside the crescent circle. Another step, and the purity test would write on me instead of around me. Another step, and the bite versus bloodline debate would stop being philosophy and turn into cartilage and decision. Behind him, the corridor whispered a promise of deeper rooms, of origin stories stored in stone, of survival horror played as a liturgy, of unexplained transformation finally explained in a way that would set the rest of my days on fire. I did not step. My body had learned the choreography of refusal from watching the lycanthrope deny gravity. The werewolf's eyes found mine, and in those amber coins I saw something I had not expected to find in that skull. Not mercy, recognition, a memory of a camp where 3 scratches stopped short of flesh. A name almost remembered and lost again. To the arithmetic of howls, the antlered absence grew impatient. The roots along the ceiling tugged, and dirt sifted down in a steady veil. The lycanthrope's hands tightened on the symbol and silver lines, brightened up its biceps and shoulders, and lapped the base of its throat like a collar closing. The werewolf howled, not at the judge, not at the rival, at me. The sound came through bone and rewrote the weather inside my skull. The pendant's heat became cold, and the 2 rhythms in my chest fused for a heartbeat before separating again. Leaving a seam where there had been none, the chamber decided to participate fully. Traps woke, chains slithered, a machine to my right clanked into a single impotent spin and died. A relic learning it could not remember function. The floor shivered along a line that ran from the corridor to the slab, a seam opening like a mouth preparing to speak. I heard a sentence arrive from a distance so far away, it might have been ahead of time. Tell your story before the next full moon. The call did not request a confession, it demanded an offering. It wanted a document written in skin and movement, and the punctuation of fracture. I stepped sideways instead of forward. The motion felt like treason to both sides. The lycanthrope's eyes narrowed. The werewolf sank on its haunches. Unwilling to be the first to break the new rules set by my refusal, the antlered figure's head turned toward me in a slow denial, and one of its antlers scored a long line in the stone overhead. Dust snowed. The line pointed to the corridor that went deeper. Something old in me stood up. It wore my grandfather's hands. It carried the smell of hearth smoke baked into paper. It touched my jaw and found the seam of a second life knitting beneath the first. It told my feet to move toward the deeper dark, because the only way out of a maze built on origins is through the oldest room. The rivals did not object. They understood escalation when they saw it. They fell upon each other again. Invigorated by my refusal, the way hunger is spiced by denial. The chapel rang with impacts and heady breath and the cold chiming of silver chains learning to sing. I moved into the throat of the corridor with the taste of iron surfacing under my tongue. The air growing warmer and then warmer still, as if I were descending, not into earth, but into a body. Behind me, the fight reached a pitch that rose beyond sound and into a pressure that changed the shape of silence. Ahead of me, the passage curved like a ribcage, and the damp smell sweetened until it was nearly floral. A garden planted with bones. I knew with the kind of certainty that punishes sleep that the choice had not been avoided, only postponed. The purity test would find me at the bottom of this curve, or at the next, or at the red moon's next insistence. The Highlands had patience, my blood did not. The corridor opened like a wound that had never closed. Heat brushed my face. A glow lifted the edges of the dark impulses that matched neither of my heartbeats. I stepped into a chamber older than the first and learned what the family had hidden, what the rivals had guarded, what the antlered judge had kept hungry for so long. That hunger had turned into law. The deeper chamber pulsed with a glow that felt more like breath than light. It came from fissures in the rock, veins of molten silver running just beneath the stone's skin, casting the walls in a cold fire that shivered with every pulse. The air was thick here, warm enough to bead sweat along my spine, yet heavy with the same metallic tenths that had clung to the Highlands since the first howl. The heat sank into my blood, and something inside me began to move, with it a slow rolling pressure that matched neither heartbeat I'd carried until now. The floor was different. No frost, no dust. The stone here had been worn glass-smooth, polished by centuries of something pacing. Circling, kneeling, the marks were faint but deep enough to be permanent. Claws scoring arcs into the surface, boots grinding heel-shaped depressions in slow ritual walks. At the center of the chamber was a circle made from that same molten silver, its edges jagged, as if hammered into the rock by something too impatient for a craftsman's hand. Inside it lay nothing but a thin sheen of water, perfectly still, reflecting the ceiling's lattice of roots, but the reflection was wrong, in it. There were 3 figures standing in the room. I turned, but behind me, there was only one, the antlered shadow. The rival predators stepped through opposite arches, like actors returning to a stage they'd bled on before. The werewolf's shoulders rolled in a restless, predatory sway. Its ribs flexing like bellows drawing heat from the air. Amber eyes burned with the ugly, honest promise of destruction. The lycanthrope entered like a general returning to a battlefield already mapped in his head. Its silver gaze flicked to the circle, then to me. As if I were an uncooperative pawn in a game it had played too many times, the judge moved to the far wall, its antlers scraping root and rock, and placed one long-fingered hand on a sigil carved into the surface. The lines ignited in dull silver, racing along the chamber walls like water through hidden channels, until they met at the molten circle. The water began to boil without movement, steam curling upward and carrying with it the scent of scorched fur and burning herbs. The chamber had been waiting for this. The werewolf moved first, a blur of hunger and hate, claws ripping the air in, ragged arcs meant to shred more than flesh. The lycanthrope slipped each blow with infuriating precision, answering with strikes that landed like verdicts, an elbow to the jaw that snapped teeth together hard enough to echo, a knee into the gut that made the werewolf's breath explode into a mist. They circled faster now, silver eyes locked to amber, the tension between them so taut it felt like the air might tear when they clashed again. It was at the very edge of the silver circle. The werewolf's paw crossed the threshold, and the molten metal surged up its arm like living mercury. It snarled, yanking back, but the silver clung, eating its way into fur and skin. The lycanthrope saw its chance and shoved forward, driving its rival deeper into the circle. The howl that erupted shook the roots overhead, dirt falling like rain. I staggered back against the wall, heat licking my face as the silver ran higher, wrapping the werewolf in bands of light that sizzled with each breath. But the animal didn't collapse, it fed on the pain, muscles swelling, fur bristling into spines, eyes rolling white before snapping back to burning gold. The light stepped into the circle. The silver didn't cling to it like a curse. Instead, the metal licked its shins, rippling like water in reverence. The 2 locked again, fangs against forearms, claws against ribs, and the silver reacted, tightening around them both, binding them together in a glow that made the chamber walls twitch. The air stank of blood and burned metal. Every strike they traded felt like it landed in my bones, my jaw aching, my lungs heaving with a rhythm that wasn't mine. The crescent at my chest had grown so hot I could feel the chain biting into my skin. The judge turned its head toward me then, as if reminding me that this wasn't a spectacle, this was a trial. The molten silver climbed higher, wrapping torsos, threading into fur, searing muscle. The werewolf's snarls turned guttural, animal noise, fighting to stay ahead of the pull into something else. The lycanthrope's face remained cold, but its strikes grew sharper, faster. Each one delivered with the precision of someone who knew this was the last round they'd ever get. The fight became less about blows and more about control. The werewolf tried to drag the lycanthrope down into the molten water at the circle's heart. The lycanthrope drove upward, forcing its rival into the air. Their bodies arched and locked like a grotesque sculpture. Steam erupted around them, filling the chamber with a choking mist that blurred the line between them until they were just 2 shadows in a single fire. The ground shook. A crack split the silver circle, spilling molten streams across the floor. The judge stepped forward, antlers low, as if to deliver the final command. My pulse roared in my ears. The pendant on my chest was no longer burning, it was pulling, drawing me toward the circle with a gravity I couldn't fight. I stepped forward once, then again. My boots splashed into the thin silver runoff, the heat biting through leather and into skin, but the pain felt distant. Both creatures froze at my approach, muscles locked, eyes fixed on me, like they'd just remembered the game's real prize. The judge raised its hand, the silver surged up my legs, the chamber roared. And I understood the purity test wasn't about proving which of them was stronger. It was about deciding which one would claim me. The silver receded like a tide in reverse, leaving behind steam and the stench of wet iron. My legs buckled at the circle's edge. The skin from knee to ankle raw and blistered, silver lines etched faint and pale beneath the burns like veins. That didn't belong to me. The pendant on my chest hung cold now, but its weight had multiplied. It felt as if each link in the chain carried a drop of the molten metal I'd just stood in. When the steam thinned, the chamber was changed. The floor's once perfect circle had warped, its edges jagged and splayed like a wound that had been forced open. The walls dripped condensation that was too thick to be water. My breath came in shallow bursts, every inhale tasting of scorched fur. Two shapes lay where the silver had bound them. One was still, its chest rising only once every few seconds. Shallow and shuddering, amber eyes half closed. Fur matted with a mix of blood and molten residue. The werewolf's body twitched in residual spasms. Muscles firing as if the fight still raged somewhere deeper than the flesh. The other shape stood, though it shouldn't have. Dark fur glistened, wet. The silver eyes colder than the stone around them. The lycanthrope moved without hurry, circling its rival, and for a moment I thought it would deliver the final blow, but it stopped, head tilting, in a way that felt less like mercy and more like calculation. A decision made in the language of predators. The judge was gone. The antlered shadow had melted back into the wall of roots without sound, leaving only a faint resin scent behind. It hadn't crowned a victor. It had simply watched hand, taken whatever it needed from both. The lycanthrope's gaze fell on me. No triumph, no warning, only an appraisal, the way one might study a reflection in still water before stepping into it. It walked past without a glance backward. Each step measured, as if to say that what had just happened wasn't an ending, it was a marking. The werewolf's breathing slowed further, chest rising once, then twice, then holding still for too long. Before a rough gasp broke the silence, its eyes flickered open enough to find me. Recognition flashed there, raw and unguarded, not a plea, not rage, something quieter, like acknowledgement. Then its gaze slipped away, and the lids closed again. The air in the chamber grew heavier the longer I stayed. I forced myself toward the tunnel, boots crunching in a fine grit of silver dust that had already begun to settle. Each step sent a throb up my legs, the burned skin pulling tight. The tunnel felt narrower now, as if the rock itself had shifted to funnel me out. By the time I reached the surface, night had spread fully over the highlands. The cold here was cleaner, sharper, but it no longer bit the same way. The snow reflected the moon in a dull sheen, and for a moment I thought I saw two moons, one white and one tinged with blood, till I blinked, and the second was gone. I made it back to camp, but the tent looked wrong, smaller, somehow, like it was a relic of someone else's life. The knot of sinew still hung from the flap, but it had changed. The broken circle in its weave had closed. Inside, my pack lay open, the grandfather's notebook on top. The crescent drawn on its last page now bore the same tiny notch as my pendant. I sat and tried to breathe normally, but the rhythm was off my lungs, filling too deep, too slow. My ears caught sounds too far away to be real. The rustle of something pacing a mile off. The snap of a branch bending under deliberate weight. I touched my jaw and felt the seam of new bone beneath the gum. A ridge that hadn't been there before, outside, somewhere in the tree line. The snow shifted. A shadow moved tall, upright, gliding. Another followed low to the ground, shoulders hunched, breath misting in jagged bursts. The silver eyes came first, then the amber. Neither crossed the open ground. They didn't have to. They had left something here. The highlands did not sleep. They waited. Snow fell in slow, deliberate spirals, each flake tracing its own descent, as if careful not to disturb the ground's memory. The cold wasn't clean anymore. It carried the musk of the two shapes pacing the edge of the tree line, each one a shadow I could name by scent alone. One moved with the low, restless sway of a creature born to hunt by impulse. The other stood in stillness, an outline cut into the dark. Its weight distributed like a man who has never stumbled. They did not fight, not tonight. Their rivalry had shifted, stretched into something that could live without claws for now. They were waiting to see which way I would break. The tent flap stirred without wind. I stayed still. Watching the shadow it cast on the snow, long, narrow fingers ending in crescents that were neither nails nor claws. It lingered for a heartbeat, then withdrew, leaving only the soft hiss of snow settling where it had stood. In the quiet, my heartbeat no longer sounded like my own. It had split two separate rhythms threading together, each pulse carrying a different temperature. When I inhaled, the air smelled layered, pine resin, burnt silver, wet fur, and something darker beneath. A note of soil turned by old roots. The pendant at my chest lay cool against the skin. But I knew it wasn't dormant, it was patient. Every so often, it tugged not toward the werewolf or the lycanthrope, but toward the deeper dark beneath the hollow tree, toward the judge, toward whatever law it had written into my bones when I stepped into that circle. Far off, the first howl rose, ragged, feral, a sound that peeled the silence open. It was answered a breath later by one smooth and unbroken. A note so steady it felt like judgment. The two threads of sound climbed the air together until they met over the clearing, weaving into a single, impossible chord. I closed my eyes and still saw them, amber and silver, burning in the dark, like the memory of fire. I knew this wasn't the end. This was the blood's long echo. A call that wouldn't stop until the verdict was carried out. If you feel the air change on your skin one night, heavy and close, if you hear two voices answering each other from opposite sides of the dark, don't move, don't breathe, don't think you can hide. Because they aren't fighting over territory, they're fighting over you. And if your story ends in fur and moonlight, send it to us before you change again. And for those who hunger for more, step deeper into the shadows with our Ultimate Werewolf Horror playlist linked in the description below. In the world of horror, the scariest things happen when you least expect them, and trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.